On today's video, we're going to complete the stained glass inspired wool applique project, finishing it off with decorative stitching and complementary quilting. In our last video, we started working on this great Kingfisher wool applique quilt design. We assembled the pattern, marked and fused them in place, and then stitched them down. Now it's time to start in on our decorative stitching and then finish it up with some free motion quilting. So let's get started. It's time to quilt! First, we need to complete the picture we started, and that means filling in the grasses around the tree. I've just started to put in the grasses, but instead of applique, I'm using decorative stitches for this part of the design. You can see here where I started yesterday, stitching this set of these grasses with the leaves offset on each side using a wool thread. This one stitch with the leaves on alternating sides is stitch 138 on my Bernina 880. The first thing I did before I started working on the stitching was to work on what I call my stitch library. On a new page, I made some test stitches with different threads to choose exactly which stitches I wanted and what settings I wanted to use. I chose some with different leaf patterns, one for a regular grass and one for a cattail end. Now my machine lets me file the stitches as they're set, like files on a computer. If yours doesn't, you want to make extra sure you write all of that information down in your notes so you don't forget. And that's something I do anyway, using an ink pen to mark on these pages. Next, I'm going to retrace some of the chalk marks for the grasses so they stand out better. I'm also going to mark a line at the edge of the design where I want the grasses to stop. For the threads, I'm using some 12-weight wool acrylic blends from Aurifil and some 12-weight cotton from Sulky with a little variegation. The difference in fibers gives a good look for the grasses. The wool fibers in particular give the stitching almost a hand-stitched look, especially with longer stitch lengths. Overall, I'm using 4 colors here. One of them is a pretty close match for the wool felt I used for the tree, or it may be a touch redder. There are also a couple of muted greens, one a bit lighter than the other. The real key is that you want earth tones that look natural, not colors that stand out in a way that takes attention away from the brightly colored bird. And for all of these, I use 60-weight black polyester in the bobbin. I've switched feet, because I figured out that I had developed a rough burr on my old and well-used 20D foot, which had been causing some thread breaks yesterday when I started using the 12-weight variegated tan cotton. The Bernina, for some reason, won't say presser foot pressure, but I want it at 35. I'm using a tooth flosser from GUM to help thread this thick thread through the needles. It helps to cut the pointy end of the flosser at an angle. The flosser fits through the eye of this 116 top stitch needle and pulls the thread through with it. You really can't use the automatic threader with this kind of 12 weight. It just splits the thread. The 12 weight red brown wool blend thread works great for this cattail reed. I can go a little bit faster on this simple stitch. Stop just before the cattail top, leaving about 1/8 of an inch. Change your stitch setting to make the top of the cattail. You can turn it very slowly as you stitch, so that the top looks like it's waving a bit. Repeat the process until you're happy with the number of them, marking them out, and then stitching. You can add some straight reeds too with a long stitch length. I used a slightly darker green for those. Before stitching over the appliques, I'm switching to a Schmetz Super Non-Stick needle. Because I'm stitching through both a couple of layers of wool and steam-a-seam in between, I've found the needles can get covered with gum and fluff otherwise. In planning stitches for some of the feathers on the bird, you may want to search on the web for belted kingfisher, so you can see how they are marked in nature. The tail feathers have an even, check-like design when they are sitting like our Kingfisher is. Testing on my stitch library again, I found a stitch that when worked carefully makes a satisfactory similar look. I start at the bottom with just one repeat and add repeats to each row as I go up the tail. At this point, I decided I wanted to do the rest of the feathers as free motion quilting, so let's go ahead and sandwich the quilt to get it ready. For the back, I used a black Kaufman cotton called quilter's linen. It isn't really linen, but it has a kind of linen patterned look to it. It's widely available and will make a good backing for this if you're making it as a wall hanging. I prepared it with lightweight interfacing. I'm also using an 80/20 Hobbs cotton poly blend batting, also in black. Once I have put down the top and smoothed it out, I lift up the top and spray the batting lightly with a basting spray like Sulky KK2000 before smoothing it back down. Lift up the other half, spray the rest of it, and then smooth it back down. Continue on and make sure to spray both between the batting and the back, and then between the top and the batting. Then make sure everything is smoothed out and ready to work with. Machine baste the edges. I have a machine basting stitch on my sit-down Bernina Q20 long arm, but you can do this at your domestic machine. In fact, if you're doing the free motion quilting on a domestic machine, you may want to take a look at the short video about setup that I posted earlier. Many machines now have a special stitch for basting, but if yours does not, lengthen your straight stitch as long as possible and use that. I've demonstrated basting a few times before, so I'll try not to bore you repeating too much of the process here. After basting around the edges, I do a stitch in the ditch around the appliques. I stitch as close as possible to the edges to stabilize them and make the shape stand out a little more. I used a black 40-weight polyester thread with a 90-14 top stitch needle, and I have a 60-weight black polyester in the bobbin. Before we go further, it looks like I need to slightly adjust the laser pointer on my Q20. It's important that it really be precisely aligned. Even a 32nd of an inch off can put it off track. A white piece of paper taped down with masking tape helps me pinpoint where the laser is pointing versus where the needle will hit. Stitch a hole in the paper with a needle. Then there are 2 thumb screws you loosen, one that lets you adjust the aim front to back, and the other that lets you adjust right to left. When you have the pointer aligned with the hole the needle made, tighten them back down, and you're set to continue. There's actually quite a bit of stitching to do around the edges of all the appliques, but it's worthwhile to help them stand out more and to really stabilize them for quilting. size stippling pattern, I added just a little fill stitching between the bird and the corners of the quilt for some extra stabilizing. We will come back and fill in the entire black background after we have finished with the appliques. So this stabilizing stitching will just become part of the background. At this point, I think I have enough stitching down on the background to stop the fabric from bubbling up on me while I'm working. For stitching in the details on and around the appliques, we'll start with a variegated 40-weight brown polyester to add details to the tree trunk and branches. I have some more variegated threads on order, but this one, called Fantastico by Superior, is one of the few I have here at the moment. Then we'll move on to a blue 12-weight cotton by Wonderfil called Spaghetti and a white 40-weight poly to match the different parts of the bird. I'll keep a 60-weight poly in the bobbin, mostly black except when I'm working on the white parts of the bird. One trick I'm using here to switch from the black thread I was using before is to tie the threads together, then pull the new thread all the way through the machine's workings to the needle. Then with this 40-weight thread, the machine automatic threader works just fine. I'll use a top stitch needle for all of this, maybe 116 or 9014. I won't use the super non-stick needles here because the eyes of the needle are too small for free motion stitching. I'm quilting an elongated stippling pattern along the branches to look like wood bark. Sometimes I'll add a little bit of a swirl like a wood knot too. Overall, the pattern is similar to a regular stippling, but it's drawn out in the direction each piece of the tree or branch seems to be growing. Between the pattern and the variegated thread, you get a pretty good design for tree bark. Now we need to change to the 12-weight blue cotton, using the tie-off trick again. You can't pull it through the needle. The knot where they've tied together would probably break the needle, but you can get it up to that point. Usually a 12-weight thread won't work with the auto threader, but this spaghetti cotton is really tight, and I guessed right that it would work with the 9014 top stitch needle on my Q20. With this thread, you want to free motion embroider the Kingfisher's tufted head feathers. The color was almost a perfect match for the wool, which makes this really work well. I'm going to continue on making some simple U-shaped curves elsewhere on the blue parts of the bird to mimic a series of feathers. The really small pieces of light blue appliques are really too small for more quilting. I'm quilting the white section of the bird's tummy just like the wings, with a repeated curve for a feather pattern, but I just changed thread and the bobbin to white. The last step in the quilting is filling in the rest of the background. I've switched back to black polyester both for the bobbin and the top thread. I'm running at 10 stitches per inch with my Bernina stitch regulator set to BSR1, as I have for pretty much all of the free motion quilting. Stitching around the weeds and grass, you want to be a little careful. If you have to cross over them, cross over one of the straight grasses with longer stitch length. Try not to cross over the fronds of the boulder cattails. In the larger areas, you have a little room for some more creativity in the stitching. Maybe some decorative swirls or other patterns. Just sort of travel between the swirls using stippling. None of this stitching is going to be highly visible on the thick black wool, but that's sort of the point. You want to let the main design stand out. After finishing the quilting, press the quilt, preferably upside down on a wool mat, and square it up to a 21 inch by 21 inch piece. You can now either bind the piece for a wall hanging or use it as the top of a decorative pillow cover for a 20 inch by 20 inch pillow insert, as I did. I decided not to add cording to the edge as I used a heavy black denim for the pillow cover back. I used a button opening, but use whatever pillow cover method you prefer. I hope you've had fun with this project. If you've enjoyed this video, the most important thing you can do to support new content for this channel is to subscribe. It's free and will tell you when I put out my next videos. Liking the videos would help too. As always, if you have any comments or questions, please post them below. I'm usually pretty quick about answering them. Stay tuned because I'm working on a design for an elegant Thanksgiving table runner. just in time for the holidays. It will have some applique, a little piecing, and some custom embroidery designs that I've already been fine-tuning. Until next time, have fun in your studios!